Welcome, everyone, to the final webinar of our three-part series on energy modeling for better policymaking. And this is a particular webinar to look at the new approaches to modeling, how they can help decision and policy making in the energy sector, how we can look beyond electricity, beyond some of the traditional aspects. We've perhaps looked at new innovative approaches for doing so. My name is Ben Clues. I'm the Head of Research and Engagement for the Applied Research Program on Energy and Economic Growth, and I'm a Senior Consultant at Oxford Policy Management. The Applied Research Program on Energy and Economic Growth, or EEG, is a 5-year program led by Oxford Policy Management and is funded by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. It produces cutting-edge research on the links between energy and economic growth. And by pioneering such research, we hope to promote evidence-based programming, policymaking, and ultimately help bring benefits of modern energy services for all. We also host a roundtable on energy planning. From OPM's side, I'm joined by Simon Trace, the Program Director of the EG Initiative. And Simon will also help ensure that your questions of the audience are answered in this webinar. We have 5 outstanding panelists today. Dr. Taneja from the University of Massachusetts and Stephen Lee from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, are both pioneering machine learning, artificial intelligence, and statistical estimation methods. Jay applies this, amongst many things, in an EG research project on electricity demand forecasting in Ethiopia. And Stephen is the author of a forthcoming EG paper on probabilistic forecasts of electricity demand. Dr. Steve Pye from the University College London and Dr. Matteo Rocco from Politecnico di Milano use innovative approaches to assess the whole energy system and their links to the economy, emissions, and wider challenges. Steve is also part of the FCDO-funded research program on climate-compatible growth. That is not part of EG, but nonetheless, we are closely aligned. So it's great to have that represented here too. Last but not least, Dr. Rachel Freeman from University College London is broadening this whole wider sector perspective by incorporating political and social factors into energy models. So you, the attendees, the audience here, will not be visible or audible during this webinar, but please ask questions. And the way to do it is at the bottom of your screen, you will find a Q&A function, and you can post your question there. You can even vote things up or down, and we will answer them as we go along in this 1-hour webinar. You can, in addition, post comments and reflections in the chat function down there as well. And again, we'll monitor that. This webinar is recorded and it will be available through the EG website afterwards. So let's start. And I would start with just some initial questions before opening it up. So you, the audience, do keep posting from the beginning, and anytime we're more than eager to engage in this discussion, keep it lively. So starting with you, Steve Pye, one of the main messages from our previous 2 EEG webinars is that the key to modeling is clarity on the question or the energy sector challenge that we hope to resolve. So why do you then believe it is important to seek new and novel modeling approaches and apply them in emerging countries?
Thanks very much, Ben, for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a long tradition of energy modeling going back some way, but we're in a period where there's big changes going on in the energy system in terms of low carbon transition. Fossil fuel incumbents are in trouble. We've got renewables plummeting in terms of their cost. We've also got a changing policy landscape in terms of people or governments, countries looking at net zero targets, ratcheting up an NDC ambition. And therefore, I think there's a need for a rethink in terms of some of the modeling approaches that we've been using. And last year, we published a paper in Climate Policy that looked at some of the sort of needs, along with Rachel here, looked at some of the needs for modeling in respect of this kind of new environment. And that was, they were sort of categorized in terms of scope, function, and approach. So it's about, what we include in models, the functionality of those models, but also can we use them in a better way? So what just to reflect a little bit on the climate compatible growth program that you mentioned, Ben, we're trying to make this happen in terms of developing and building approaches with countries in the global south to think of better and more developed approaches, modeling approaches that we can embed within policymaking that can make a real difference. And just to mention a couple of some of the areas of focus for that program in respect of energy and transport modeling. So it's a bit broader than just electricity. So there's an emphasis in terms of improving spatial data and modeling to inform demand and supply. We're also very interested in the nexus issues, so the interconnectedness of systems between energy, land, water, and economy. We also think there's a gap in terms of transition risk. So there's been a lot of modeling that's been done that's been very deterministic in nature. And I think there's definitely a recognition that we need to improve our consideration of uncertainty and what that then means in terms of how decision makers can manage risks going forward. And then maybe one other thing to mention is this idea of modeling at different scales. So while our focus under CCG is very much on the national context, we also want to bring that sort of global scale understanding to the party, so to speak. So that's kind of thinking about market risks, so particularly for oil and gas transitions in terms of global prices, but it's also thinking about some of the opportunities of, if we build systems that are regional or global, how will that help in terms of transitions going forward? So just to give one tangible example, I'm probably running over my 2 minutes, but just one example, we've one of the first projects under CCG was to develop an analysis that basically looked at the India Gulf region and looked at how transmitting high levels of renewable generation through an interconnector to India would help in terms of utilizing the vast renewable resources of the Gulf region and provide electricity to those large demand centers in India. And in effect, helping with that program or prospect of coal phase out going forward. So that was coupling like a big energy systems model with a global electricity model using Plexos. So with, so those
great link actually, because I think this coupling of the energy and economic activity is, and I'd love to hear more about that India project later, but perhaps handing over to Matteo here, because I think that is very much at the heart of what you're looking at. Often these aspects are looked at separately. So Matteo, perhaps could you elaborate a little bit on what approaches exist and why we should model that nexus, that connection between economic and energy?
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for the question. Actually, it's very broad. I would try to focus on why we should pursue the modeling integration, because I think it's central here. And according to scientific literature, the urgency and scale of current environmental challenges invoke for integrated modeling frameworks that are capable to perform quantitative assessments of future transition pathways by properly dealing with several challenges. And I want to list 3 of these challenges that I believe are really central. First, we need to have models and modeling frameworks capable of capturing engineering details, so providing an accurate representation of physical engineering system, and this is particularly relevant for energy technologies, which need to be modeled with high space and temporal detail. And there are out there plenty of energy system models, either optimization or simulation models that are dealing with this aspect very well. The second challenge that must be fulfilled meanwhile is capturing the economic dynamics and social dimension. And again, there are many models out there. There are the mainstream models for economic analysis that are computable general equilibrium models. Again, mainstream, widely adopted, but recent literature is claiming for new models that are capable of properly modeling economic complexity that is usually overlooked by CGE, like the nonlinearity, path dependency, agents heterogeneity, behavioral elements, and finance, which is something that is often overlooked in mainstream models, and contemplating the existence of multiple equilibria, so describing the economy as an evolving and adaptive system. So models that are currently adopted to deal with such challenges beyond CGE are macroeconometric models, agent-based models, system dynamic models, and stock flow consistent models. And then in the end, the last aspect that I believe is central is the capability of such integrated frameworks of capturing multiple impact dimension and ecological phenomena in a life cycle perspective. So as an example, we all know that renewable-based energy transition invokes for large consumption of primary rare materials and scarce materials. And this is an aspect that is often overlooked by purely energy and economic integrated models. And there is the community of industrial ecologists out there that is particularly active in providing life cycle-based and input-output-based model to do so. So to conclude, a reliable, meaningful, and scientifically sound scenario analysis must be grounded on such integrated energy economic modeling frameworks capable of dealing with such mentioned critical aspects, identifying cross-relations and trade-offs. And currently, there are several attempts to deal with such challenges with integrated assessment models, the so-called well-known class of models of EAMS, performing either soft, hard, or full integration between different type of models. And based on my current knowledge, existing integrated models are mostly based on the integration, on the soft integration between energy models, so detailed engineering based energy models, and CGE model mostly. And so the integration of the energy model with other classes of models is somehow lagging behind based on my understanding. And this is something that really need to be explored if we want to meet the current challenges. This is my view.
And of course, you are much closer involved in all of this than me, but one of the challenges will be to actually operationalize these models and to populate them, to have them functioning. And Jay, what opportunities then exist for new ways of doing that computationally, machine learning, artificial intelligence, other such methods? And you're using satellite data in your EEG project. Perhaps you can also talk about how you bring in some of that. A bit
Fantastic.
Of
Yes. So I think one of the key, a couple of the key benefits of machine learning techniques to be inputs to some of these large energy systems models. So in low income regions, low resource regions, one of the biggest challenges is just that you don't have a lot of quantitative data. You don't have great sensor measurements. You don't necessarily have great understanding of where existing infrastructure is and what the socioeconomic conditions are of households and businesses and things like that. So machine learning really allows a couple of different benefits here. One is to ingest new and large different kinds of data sources. So instead of just working on 1 or 2 or 3 data sources where we understand exactly, or we have a reason of how these factors connect, you can ingest larger and different kinds of models. In the example that you mentioned, we're working with satellite data from a satellite that went up in 2018 that measures tropospheric pollution. So essentially measuring nitrogen dioxide, methane, and other chemicals that are in the atmosphere that can relate to what's happening on the ground. And that's a new, different data set that we haven't necessarily merged into existing energy systems models. Another key benefit is that you're allowed to that you're able to fill in gaps in reading. So you can understand what might be happening spatially in areas where you're not exactly measuring, and what might be happening temporally in times that you didn't measure. By building models that can ingest large amounts of data and try to understand some of the patterns that occur among different data sets, you're able to fill in some of those pieces. And so our work on this is to essentially provide guidance for both agricultural as well as energy and electricity policymakers about how to expand their system, particularly by trying to find areas that have large amounts of irrigation already happening that is powered by diesel generators. Those diesel generators are opportunities to electrify relatively quickly. You know there's enough income in those places to run those diesel generators. And so you know you have enough load that it can actually sustain the electricity business, but you might not know exactly where those systems are. So we're looking at pollution data and trying to see if we can discover where those sites are and do it in a way that's scalable over the entire country by using some advanced machine learning models. Thanks, Ben.
Great. And Stephen Lee, your EEG paper that's forthcoming argues that we need to acknowledge the uncertainty more in models, and it's something Steve Pye said in his opening comments as well. So maybe just revisiting that, how can probabilistic modeling help improve decision making?
Thanks, Ben. And I think it's appropriate that I'm following Jay. Some of this work, well, isn't in very much the same spirit as what Jay's doing. And actually, Jay's my research is guided by Jay to an extent. So to your question, I think probabilistic models, well, it's first useful, I think, to just understand, well, the costs and benefits of, well, really the costs of underinvesting and overinvesting. So if you underinvest, you really don't benefit from the economies of scale to planning energy and electricity systems. And if you're overinvesting, there's kind of this secretly pernicious penalty that you pay, where if you're in a country with scarce resources like those in the global south, well, overpaying in one area means not paying in another area. And because of these sort of diminishing marginal utility effects, you really do harm your whole picture if you're over investing. And we've run optimization models that will try to plan energy systems in several contexts now, and they show very high sensitivity to both aggregate demand forecasting and so you know, where is aggregate demand for a large region, but also the heterogeneity. So what individual customers where demand what. So what we're seeing is that, well, demand forecasting generally is really important, and we're also finding that it's incredibly difficult. If you look at some of the more famous demand forecasts, maybe by the IEA or EIA, we don't want to pick on anyone, but over several years, they perform quite poorly, actually, making it, well, showing that it's very difficult to plan overall. Now, when we look at probabilistic forecasting, the best comp is these sort of point forecasts. And what we're seeing and what we argue is that, well, some of these point forecasts might lead to some sort of paralysis with regards to decision making. If you have a point forecast that is accurate on average, even if it's a perfect forecast, if there are outliers, and if, you know, sometimes maybe the model, you know, a model might be certain in some region and uncertain in others, if they're all represented in the same way, decision makers may actually discount the benefit of the whole data set, or the whole set of inferences, if you will. So this is where, in our view, probabilistic forecasting comes in, and it really can help drive a lot of more advanced decision making under uncertainty. So I can dive into this a little bit more, but there's dynamic planning and adaptive planning models that can use these probabilistic forecasts, as well as decision making frameworks that work in high certainty and low certainty environments. So you know, if you're in a low certainty environment, you can really plan for larger systems that meet your expected forecasts, your expected demand. But if you're in a high uncertainty environment, you may really prefer more modular investments. So things that benefit from real options to produce more, to build in the future. And also real options to have flexibility within your different solutions. So in terms of electricity, this may take the form of grid compatible mini grid, which costs more than maybe a cheaper, just grid incompatible with mini-grid.
So that's a great overview and lots to explore further. And I guess one of those factors of determining uncertainty, but also feasibility, is of course the social and political reality. And Rachel, you're trying to incorporate that into models. How do you do that?
It's difficult. You have to include things that are not usually measured. So that means sometimes creating ways of measuring things on a relative basis. So what we've been doing is really aiming at increasing the realism of energy transition modeling through including the factors that we know to be important because we've seen them happen. So it's partly based in a historical view of what, especially what we've seen in the UK in the last couple of decades. So really the realism is sort of what you expect compared to what you get. So looking at that historical period, we see that policy and politics are very much part of the mix. Policymakers themselves are actually part of the system. So usually energy models, they create a sort of representation of the energy system, and the policymakers are sort of outside the system, just sort of pulling levers here and there, and then you get a response in the system. That's kind of how they're generally presented, and there's a sort of assumption of fairly good expected response across society. And we know that's not always the case. Sometimes you get a pushback where policies are very unpopular, and policymakers, politicians have to pull them back. Sometimes they take off really well, and they go so well that they actually take off too fast and they run out of funds. So, and the demand and supply side are really, really different in terms of these kind of factors. So on the supply side, you have generally professional people who work in, large companies, who are paid to think about these kind of things, and there's a lot of formal process of decision making. And on the demand side, of course, everybody is a demand actor, if you like. We buy equipment that uses energy. We use that equipment in different ways. We choose things based on lots of different factors. Some of them have got nothing to do with energy. So this is the sort of reality of for example, policy making that looks at, for example, rolling out new technologies to bring about energy transition. The factors there are really, really varied. So what we've been doing is adding those factors in as well as we can, by looking at what's happened historically and trying to represent that kind of typical pattern. For example, how much do new technologies bother people? Are they really annoying? Are they expensive? That's so in the model that makes them less likely to be taken up. Our technology is extremely difficult, like nuclear. Sometimes nuclear power just never even reaches sort of self-sufficiency in terms of economic self-sufficiency, and needs continual government investment. So these are the kind of issues that we've been modeling, and it shows a sort of quite of a non-linear behavior in terms of achieving energy transition when you include these factors. So there's a sort of minimum amount of political capital you need to get things done. If you don't have that, it just will not take off.
And we'll come back to some of that. There are a few questions in the Q&A function, and Simon, maybe we could open up and look at some of those.
Yeah, there's a couple. Jay's had a go at answering one of them already, or starting the conversation, but they kind of overlap. They're both from sort of global south perspective. One is maybe touches on this sort of interfaces between models that Matteo was talking about earlier, and that's how do you adapt existing energy models to be able to sort of cope with challenges around the energy land water nexus, and particularly climate change. So that's a sort of an adaptation question, and then the other question is more of an availability question, which is how can you, given the importance of modelling now, how can you ensure there's availability of sophisticated energy modelling software to emerging economies and countries? So what can be done there? Just encourage the audience, please, if you want to ask more questions, to use the Q&A function to do so. We will bring them up in these rounds every so often. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. So the first question is on the nexus between energy, land, water, and potentially health even, and other dimensions. So maybe Matteo, starting with you on that, and then Steve Pye.
Yeah. Okay. So regarding the issue that is really relevant of capturing the ecological feedbacks that may emerge from the climate change. So of course there are more countries in the global south that are more vulnerable with respect to I would say richer country than the north. And I would say the answer is in pushing the integration, so to put more effort in integrating the models, especially also the ecological part of the story, ecological side of the story. I see many efforts in coupling energy models and economic models that are, of course, dealing just with the I would say the social side of the story. So the industrial system are linking the energy system as an industrial system together with the economy and looping the model together, taking into account in a very simplistic way the feedbacks deriving from climate change. That, by the way, I can understand are also very complex, very difficult to be included in the model due to the fact that, of course, these are affected by great uncertainty. So there are great effort. I could mention, for instance, the CLUES model suite developed at KTH, for instance, to focus on a specific side of the story, that is the climate, land, energy, water integration, and that probably is taking into account also some feedbacks and some effects coming from the climate change. And there are many attempts of doing so, and I would say we should keep moving in this direction, but it's really hard due to the fact that we know, let's say, it's really complex to include the feedbacks from the ecology inside an integrated model in a consistent manner. Also keeping into account, that this is the last point, the fact that we should also keep into account how the people can adapt to climate change effects. And so also the macroeconomic model, I would say, should be equipped. It should be also should be able to keep into account the fact that people are also reacting, and society is reacting to climate change also differently with respect to the level of wealth. I don't know if the panelists would add something more with respect to this point.
Steve, maybe you? Sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think. Yeah, I strongly recognize the issue of system type approaches, and you, Matteo, you mentioned the CLUES framework, which is the sort of really well-known one that kind of brings together sort of land, energy, and water in a kind of coherent system to look at kind of resource availability. And we know that many energy systems are, hugely dependent on resources from land. Water resources, particularly those hydro-dependent countries. So I think building towards those sorts of frameworks is crucially important. And just to pick up on the uncertainty piece, I mean, I think going for a more sort of probabilistic approach where we test, the vulnerabilities of those land and water systems in relation to energy, I think is a really important direction to go down as well, moving away from a more sort of deterministic view. And just to come on to the subsequent question, if I may, Ben, I mean, I think in terms of access to these models, I mean, I think particularly the CLUES framework, there's been a lot of investment or time spent in terms of ensuring that those sorts of models are openly available. So there's a kind of open access, open source ethos behind those tools. And, you know, the folks who've been working on those sorts of models have put a lot of investment into building a community of practitioners around those sorts of modeling systems. So, but of course, you know, with all of these models, it's an extremely time-intensive and resource-intensive business. But at least that community and those tools are kind of there as starting points to kind of move into that space.
Jay, maybe you. I mean, your work looks at irrigation and another sort of factor of that nexus, and you apply machine learning to it. Arguably, at least for the lesser initiated person, machine learning and such tools sound even more complex. So how again, to both questions, I mean, what's the opportunity here using such techniques, but also what's then the side of making it available to decision makers, to policymakers in the countries you.
Sure, and this is actually a very open challenge. I can't purport that we have a great solution here, in that many machine learning models are essentially black boxes. You put in any number of inputs. There's a box that does this computation, whatever else. It finds these nonlinear relationships between those inputs, things like that, and you get some output. There's a strong movement within the machine learning community to start to obtain more transparency, essentially learn what parameters, what factors are influencing. But even then, that's not necessarily enough to kind of make these models a lot more tractable, understandable, usable in real applications. So I'd say that as a community, there's a lot of room to improve that. Now, as far as how to make these more palatable for application, I think engaging at the level of you don't necessarily have to understand how the math works, but engaging at the level of understanding what the inputs are and kind of what the purpose of the modeling is. This has to be multilateral. It can't be just coming from academics or coming from research labs. Engagement with policymakers is crucial, and I think it's one of the hallmarks of the EEG design, and I really appreciate that. But as the systems become more complex, that engagement becomes only more important.
And we've got, I think, one question at least that's on a similar theme from the audience, but there's also quite a few other questions. So Simon, maybe if you could share a few of those with us.
Well, I think the question I wanted to raise here, which just sort of tags on to what Jay's been talking about, and maybe it's partly covered in that, but it's still maybe worth considering. It's this sort of idea that the ever more complex and data-intensive modelling it's accompanied with a loss of intuitiveness, and how in those cases do you help policymakers understand what the levers for change are? So, I mean, if anybody wants to add to what Jay's already said on that, that would be great. Just on the other questions, then I think a couple that might be interesting, sort of coming back to things that Rachel was talking about earlier on. I guess, how do you model things like political capital and policy makers in the sort of general energy systems model? The methodologies and assumptions around that. I think maybe if we leave it for that for now, and then I'll maybe summarize some more later. But those two seem to be particularly relevant to the conversation that we just had.
Thanks, Simon. So the sort of black box, ever more complex model question. Jay, you've alluded to it. Stephen, sure.
Sure. Yeah, just to build on that. Well, yeah, I think, well, this relates a little bit to, so there's kind of this trade-off in machine learning between human interpretability, so intuitiveness, and not. Actually, unfortunately, some of the best models that use the most and most diverse different data sources are black boxes. And actually, as you add human interpretability, model results and quality degrades. So there's actually kind of this ironic trade-off, if you will, and that's a problem for sure. Something that we're looking at to at least help with this dynamic is this uncertainty, actually, that we were just talking about, where if you don't have uncertainty, actually the status quo in planning, so kind of the way that these model results are used currently, is one-shot master planning. So you have maybe one master plan that lasts for 10 years, and it's done by some agency or consultant, and it's done in 1 year, and you kind of quickly find that it quickly becomes obsolete. The situation on the ground changes and technologies change, and really this is what's happening everywhere all the time. So if we have more adaptive models, and models additionally that characterize uncertainty, you can actually kind of change the paradigm from this one-shot planning to agencies actually using models in-house and continuously updating them. And there's this idea of information planning, where maybe if you have a model that has some demand forecast or some supply estimation of where currently people have electricity, and it conveys uncertainty, well, these are areas that you can go to and try to improve your data set in a live basis, and move again from kind of one-shot planning to live adaptive planning. And this sort of way of using models, it's, as Jay's kind of alluded to, this isn't really the status quo, it's the future, hopefully. We think adds a lot of benefit, or potential benefit, in well, having people use models and understand what's going on.
And that's almost the other side of the political capital question, isn't it? Of how you, and maybe Rachel, it's the question to you. I mean, you're looking at, and there's the specific question of how you incorporate political capital, but then also how do you keep it usable by policymakers, and is that part of the realism of those models? Maybe you could share a few thoughts on that.
Yeah. I just want to comment on the previous discussion, because the model I've been developing, several other models, it takes a bit of a sort of a lateral jump, because it represents issues such as measure diffusion, economics, through a much more conceptual level. So we don't actually do economic analysis in the current version of the model. It's very much based on sort of key characteristics of things, so that basically enables you to keep the model very small. So my model, the current model, only has about, I don't know, less than 300 variables, which is quite small for a big whole energy system model. So it's very much looking at the what we call soft variables, and their relationship to technology development and technology adoption. So that's one way you can do it, which is, it's troublesome because you have to spend a lot of time working on the theory of the model. You have to spend actually the majority of the time justifying the approach before you get to actually do the simulations. So it's kind of front loaded in that way, compared to other models where you're taking hopefully, well, in some cases you will have that data available, or you might have to go and collect it, and then bringing that into some kind of mathematical representation, mathematical calculations that give you the kind of answers you're interested in. Yeah, and it's a similar thing. I think we've at UCL we've done a lot of what we call socio-technical energy transition modeling. So, and that can include things like actor modeling, ABM. My model, I used system dynamics, which you include both hard and soft variables, so things that are not usually measured, or you have to sort of invent a way to measure them. Analytica we've been using, and there are sort of other complexity methods that can be used. But the feedback we've had so far from the policymakers that we've had involved in the project are very, very positive. So I think they're actually quite open-minded about it, as long as you can explain what you've done, why you've done it, how does it relate to, for example, the other models that are more techno-economic, and as long as you don't claim too much, in terms of what it tells you.
And Steve, hi, I feel a little guilty having cut you off earlier about your question, your aspect of the India power interconnector, but I feel it relates here because it deals with a huge degree of uncertainty. There's a strong political dimension, and I think if I heard you correctly, you're trying to do this with a whole range of different novel modeling approaches. So perhaps we could go back to that and sort of square that circle of the of that quite complex interplay of the technical, the economic, and the political in such an instance.
Sure. Yeah. No. Would be happy to. I mean, I think we're sort of coming at a lot of the kind of modeling that we're doing. Obviously, it's grounded in country level analysis, because that's where we need to inform and help support planning processes. But there's this recognition of risk and opportunity from, you know, what's going on outside the country. So the Gulf India project was very much thinking about the opportunity of, you know, large scale renewable generation in the Gulf region. This is of course relevant for other regions of the world, such as North Africa, and thinking about what that resource means and where that can help meet demand and help a certain country transition, well, both kind of export electricity, which is an economic benefit, but also meet demand in other countries. So that's one area that we were looking at opportunity. Then on the other hand, we're looking at risk for for country oil and gas producers, which I know is slightly off topic from electricity, but I mean, I think it's relevant in the sense that we're using a modeling approach whereby we're looking at sort of integrated assessment modeling scenarios, which show something about oil and gas demand going forward. And then we're using a bottom-up model of oil and gas fields and prospects at the national level, and thinking about actually what of those resources are at risk going forward as this disruptive transition unfolds. So I think, you know, in this whole area, and we're doing that using a kind of a sort of large scenario ensemble so that we can capture that uncertainty space and think about, under many different outcomes, this might be the implication for your sort of prospects as a producer going forward. So I think, yeah, it's really about thinking about the national level context, but remembering that there is a global system out there that actually has an impact on what's going on nationally.
Simon, we've got, I think, quite a few other questions in the from the audience. Perhaps we could have a couple or so more.
Yeah. Okay. I'll pick out, I guess, three, or at least merge them into three. So there's one that I missed earlier on, which was just specifically asking whether there are particular models that focus on energy demand management and forecast for residential consumption. So that was a very specific question. There's been a bit of a sort of conversation about, it's still about access to models in general, and some sort of question about whether open source models are really very reliable as of yet, or whether they're still a bit buggy, and contrasting that though with the sort of costs of sort of well-established models like Times. And also in that context, it's a question about, it's not only access to models, it's access to technical expertise and what needs to be done in order to sort of build technical expertise in emerging economies and the South in order to be able to use models, even if they are open source. And then finally, there's a very specific question to Jay, which was around irrigation and diesel sets, and basically saying that compared to Southeast Asia, where irrigation, something of the order of 36% of agricultural land is irrigated, in sub-Saharan Africa it's only about 4%. So I think the argument here is switching from diesel to electricity will make very little difference in terms of additional loads on the electricity system. So shouldn't that just be a given that we should encourage electrical powered irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa as a sort of norm? I hope that's not too much for the panel.
Right. Maybe starting in that order then, who feels like they want to talk about the residential commercial sector modeling? Matteo, or?
Yeah, we have developed some open source frameworks, and these are public and accessible online. But of course, I know that there are many other attempts around in the scientific community of developing quantitative models for assessing the demand of final users, or the demand of different energy carriers. For instance, there are some kind of stochastic models for assessing the demand of appliances by the end users, and these are particularly useful in planning because you can understand according to some kind of data sets where you can take information about the habits of the users. You can define some stochastic function for the use of such appliances, and then develop and derive the load curves for the consumption of energy carriers in general, so electricity or fossil fuels, etc., or other kind of carrier heating and cooling and blah blah blah. And this is a first class of models. So these are grounded on the behavioral side of the story, so are based on stochastic stochastic simulation and habits simulation. Then there is the other type of models that have been used, and we are developing such kind of models for assessing the demand of, for instance, the thermal and cooling demand for buildings. And these are usually based on kind of thermodynamic models for built environments. So we are representing from the thermodynamic point of view the building stock of a particular country with different type of course, of focuses and detail depending on the scope and the particular needs of the model. And then we are able to derive again the demand curves for energy carriers. I want to stress the point of the curves because we need to have a high level of resolution for demand of energy carrier if we want to. If we aim at integrating this demand with the supply side of the story, if we want to match the supply and demand and define them and find data that can be useful in energy system models. I hope I have provided at least some insights on this side of the story.
Great, and I mean it's a huge topic, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But Steve Pye, maybe moving on to this question about open source, how reliable or not, or what does access to models really mean, and what's your experience in that?
I mean, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we've another sort of effort under the CCG program so far has been to develop starter models for all African countries. Now, what those are a basic osmosis model, which is open source, and a data set to go with it. And that's really to help with kind of national planning efforts, sort of at the macro system level. Now, the question then is, these are very simple starter kits, so to speak. You know, how much value are they? And I would say, you know, they're a useful starting point to be able to then develop with country partners those models going forward. So I think there's definitely some advantage in starting simply and building up with those sort of frameworks and the kind of model tools that go with them, so that so you're developing that in partnership. And just to say that starter kit package is supported by an online open university course, and as I mentioned, there's a forum and support community network like there is for other models like LEAP, that's available to support people getting started with those sorts of models. So yeah, so I mean, yeah, that's the kind of approach that we've taken so far, is to provide something that's quite simple and use it as a starting point to then develop.
So is an open source model reliable? I mean, does it offer the same, can it entail the same level of trust that we might have in something else that we pay for and feel it's built by some expert?
I think ultimately an open source model can be it depends what you mean by reliable, but I mean, it certainly can be something that's used, you know, in the policy process. I mean, if it's open and transparent, people understand how it works. We understand the input assumptions that are going in. There's no reason why it shouldn't get traction and credibility. I think it's just the case that quite often open source models, you know, it depends on the stage of development of those models. I mean, clearly there's some sort of models that have been invested in for decades that are extremely complex, but don't have that same transparency, and maybe can sort of do analysis that other models can't do. But I think there's a spectrum there, but I don't think just because it's open source means that it can't be credible and used for serious analysis.
May I add something, Steve? Because
Sure.
Sorry, Benjamin, because I believe this is really crucial. We should distinguish between the model, like the coding that is let's say the package that is delivered that can be used from the governing principle of the model, so the equations that are behind the model. And for the energy system side of the story, looking at the energy system optimization models, the governing equations are actually, let's say, always the same. So you are looking at different models, but in the end, the governing principle are always the same. So if a research is transparent about the constraints that have been used, the data sources, and the general assumptions, then you are also able to reproduce the results and let's say, understand if the results are meaningful and if the model is run correctly. So I believe that this is really relevant, the transparency about the assumptions.
And it is also one of the things we as an energy and economic growth EEG program are really trying to promote. So one of the initiatives we run for which EEG is the secretariat, is the Roundtable Initiative on Strategic Energy Planning. And a number of leading international organizations and universities signed up for that, including UCL and Politecnico di Milano, but also the UK Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, IRENA, a number of those large entities. And that is based around very much those same principles we just talked about of national ownership, coherence and inclusivity, third, capacity, fourth, robustness, and fifth, transparency and accessibility. But there is a challenge, I feel, there is a challenge in achieving that when skills and data gaps are large, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And Rachel, your work has been perhaps more on the UK side, yet one thing you mentioned earlier is, especially when bringing in some of these, some of the analysis on heterogeneity or how the political and social factors interact, that is even more of a, the process of finding it is so important and is less reliant on these pure equations. So what does that mean? And therefore, so to this question of access to technical capital, how do you ensure that?
Well, one of the ways to look at this is not necessarily as using models to provide, say, a policy recommendation, but to actually involve the policymakers along with the other key actors in the conceptualization of how transition is going to look for each of the actors in the system. So that brings a much more holistic view. Now, that could be done in a relatively non-mathematical way. So there are soft models, there are soft systems models. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't give you a clear recommendation going forward. However, it does allow stakeholder involvement in decision making, which is not reliant on that kind of almost non-transparent system that happens within a model where you've got the data and the equations going on. So I think a mixture of those kind of soft systems methods, which allow people to really get their heads around the whole energy transition, supported by, of course, the techno-economic, the climate models, the integrated assessment models. And I think that brings in actually a more sort of rounded view of things, and also improves the policymakers' understanding of what the models do. And if there isn't enough technical knowledge, I mean, there are ways to make those models available, just providing a fairly straightforward interface, web-based interface, so anyone can go to, one that where you could perhaps put your bespoke data in there. And it's not going to be as accurate as you want, but it might be actually a sort of very rough tool to get a sense of where you want to go. And I will say that the transition very much looks, I think it really looks very different from a global south point of view to how it looks, you know, from a developed world point of view. You're moving in a different direction, right? You are developing, and at the same time you want to be decarbonizing. So it's a really different challenge than we have in the West. So I think we really need separate models, because the motivations are different, the challenges are different. Yeah, I would say we need simpler models, much more available, well documented. There are things like En-ROADS which are online, and millions of people use those models. So more of that, and more different models for different types of countries.
And we started a late, so I will take the liberty of carrying on for 5 more minutes, if that's okay. And so, sort of briefly, Stephen Lee, what does this issue of access to technical expertise mean to you when promoting the use of probabilistic or machine learning tools in the global south?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important, and actually, in addition to just having, well, more people being more well versed in what models are saying and what they're meaning. Well, first of all, you only get trust that way. So people who don't really know and know how to interpret model results may risk using these results improperly, and that can potentially create as much damage as good. So it's extremely important to get as much end user engagement and actually what's going on in the sort of gears of the model, if you will. Secondly, it's extremely important to scale the model results, because a lot of the information that's used is very local. So it's, you know, you can't have someone sitting at a university somewhere doing, well, forecasts for the whole world with really the same level of well, potential, if you will, as someone who's very local. And scaling these models is important as well. And finally, what comes to mind is actually, it touches on what Rachel was speaking about a little bit, where, well, ultimately, you don't just use your model results, you know, at face value. You always overlay, or you'd want to overlay some things that models don't consider. Maybe there's local political and cultural contexts. So in that, using the models is actually, it's almost like a cyborg approach. It's a hybrid approach of computers and humans, and kind of in, well, you know, recently there's been computers that have played the game Go better than any experts, master Go players, if you will. But actually the hybrid players perform the best. So people who have model results and human intuition. And that's how at least people that I work with view using these models, and again underscores that importance.
So Jay, not sure you see yourself as a cyborg, but to the sort of floor to you now on first that question of the specific question to you on irrigation, and is what's the opportunity here for diesel and power in Africa, but I mean maybe also that point we've heard from Rachel and Stephen about we need to combine this possibly with more than just the model, and what does that mean in a project like encouraging irrigation?
Sure. So I answered that question in the Q&A box directly. I think the gist of this is essentially what may work best for the energy system isn't necessarily the solution that's going to work at scale. and I think this harkens back to one of the other Q&A questions about the political factors, but also the economic factors that are crucial here. So in the example of irrigation, the real target there is how can you grow electricity use for this end use, this productive end use, and that of course has benefits for the farmers, the markets, the downstream processors, things like that. But what's key there is that it allows, at least for the electricity provider, it allows growth of that business. It allows that business to scale and build up an asset base that can enable scaling in the future. And I think how we incorporate those benefits, it isn't directly a benefit to the electricity system. It's not like you get additional kilowatt hours out of that or whatever else. But thinking through the kind of financial sustainability of the businesses involved is a pretty crucial part of this. And so as we kind of move the conversation from electricity access to electricity for growth, and think about how businesses and benefits to residences and things like that come from large-scale growth in electricity systems, we have to recognize, where we might have shortcomings, where it isn't enough to just get electricity out there. You might need business support. You might need understanding of downstream processing. You might need better other complementary infrastructure, roads, telco infrastructure, things like that. So I think we need to kind of take off our energy blinders and think about the bigger picture. And I think EEG as a program is moving in that direction. But I'm excited to see the entire community start to think much more broadly about energy systems, because they're just a part of a bigger picture of how you build better livelihoods.
And that's a rather nice concluding phrase. Thanks, Jay. And I really would echo that. I would like to thank all of you, the panelists, the audience, for joining today. I think this has been a really interesting webinar. We touched on many things, and many of those we'd probably like to discuss in more detail. And perhaps we can do that as part of some other webinars, as part of some other outputs we produce. And I feel I've learned a lot. I think the opportunities for this system thinking are there and are crucial. And I look forward to engaging with all of you on that. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.